your source for Orthodox books, podcasts, videos, and more. We are Ancient Faith Ministries.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, hello, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today's date is November 11th, 2024. This is our 95th lesson on the Gospel of Matthew, and tonight we're going to discuss the cleansing of the temple at Jerusalem, a very important event. We spoke about the temple, what it was like, what it looked like, how it functioned a little bit last week in last week's lesson. And today we're going to talk about the cleansing itself. We spent time last week to describe the temple for you so that you would understand something about what it was like when Jesus went there, because I think that sometimes we just picture the temple as something like a big church, but it was so much more than that. It was so huge, and it was so important in the life of Israel, in the life of the Jewish people. And so I wanted you to have some idea of the size of it, the scale of it, and what went on there. We will also be discussing some elements of the temple and the Jewish priesthood as we continue in our study of Matthew. Right now we're in chapter 21, and things are going to heat up between Jesus and the chief priests. These were the people who actually ran the temple, and that is something we'll be discussing later right here in chapter 21. So this cleansing of the temple is extremely important in the Gospels. And again, how do we know how important it is? Well, it is found in all four Gospels. And this tells us its importance, and because it had tremendous significance, and it is also something that is going to lead directly to the arrest of Jesus. This is the reason why the Jewish leaders were resolved. They were determined to put him to death as quickly as possible. And as we go on, I'll explain, why that was. But for now, let's just go ahead and read this pericope of Jesus cleansing the temple in the Gospel of Matthew, and it begins in verse 12. And Jesus entered the temple of God and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you made it a den of robbers." And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings you have brought perfect praise?" And leaving them, he went out to the city of Bethany and lodged there. Okay, so that's our pericope for today. And we're going to discuss some historical elements of the temple also, along with some patristic statements about this particular event. The first thing to notice, and perhaps you know this, I'm not sure if you do, but even though this event is recorded in all four Gospels, because I do believe, they don't say why, but I do believe it's because it was the motivation for the arrest of Jesus by the chief priests. Even though it is in all four Gospels, it's placed in a different place in John's Gospel. John's Gospel has this, the cleansing of the temple, early in Christ's ministry as his first public event, not first miracle. That's the wedding at Cana, the changing of water into wine, but that was kind of private. Only the disciples and the servants who drew the water knew about that miracle. But the first public event that is recorded by John is this exactly, the cleansing of the temple. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus didn't do other things before this, other healings, or obviously preaching and things like this. By the time he gets to Jerusalem and has the cleansing of the temple, I think he's already well known by many people and regarded already as a prophet by the Jews at the time. So it's not his first. Remember that when the evangelists choose to describe the first event in the Gospels, it's not that that's the first thing that Jesus did. It's what they choose to relate to us, and that usually has a lot of significance. And so, for example, the first public event in Matthew's Gospel is, as described, not the first thing Jesus did. He was baptized, he's tempted by the evil one, he calls his first disciples. Matthew and Mark and Luke all describe how Jesus traveled all around Galilee, but then they each describe something different as their first event that they choose to describe in their gospel. And for Matthew, it's the Sermon on the Mount. It's not a miracle, it's his teaching. It's presenting Jesus as the new Moses. That's a very important theme for Matthew. In Luke, the first public event that is described by Luke, again, after he says that Jesus traveled all around and things like this, and healed people and preached all around Galilee, he returns to Nazareth. And the first public event that St. Luke describes in his gospel is in chapter 4. And that is the Lord preaching in the synagogue of Nazareth, reading from the prophecy of Isaiah, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has sent me out to proclaim the good news and to to heal the sick, etc. So then Jesus says, this is fulfilled in your hearing. And in the beginning, everybody is impressed by him, but then he says something that they find offensive and they try to kill him. And that's his welcome home, Jesus. That's the Gospel of Luke. The first event, public event in the Gospel of Mark is in chapter 1, because Mark doesn't have the birth of Jesus. And the first public event is an exorcism, a very dramatic exorcism. Again, each of these fits the specific theme and purpose of each evangelist. They're trying to bring out something that they think is most important for us to understand about Jesus Christ, and it fits their theme. So that's why I think that the cleansing of the temple is a little bit different in John, but also there might be another reason. There's a lot of disagreement about this among scholars as to which one is correct. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the cleansing of the temple at the very end of Jesus's ministry. Luke has it, John has it at the beginning. Almost like his calling card. He's letting them know that he's arrived and he means business. And this sort of gets them against him. The Jewish leaders are against him from the very, very beginning in Jerusalem. Well, which one is it? And people don't agree on this. I'm inclined to believe or to think that John's is the correct one, that he did this earlier in his ministry. So why would Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it at the very end? There are two reasons why they would present it at the very end. First of all, because they are very clearly tying it to Jesus's arrest and subsequent execution on the cross, all of which is orchestrated by temple authorities. So I think that they're making a very explicit connection between it, but it's more than that. It's kind of really simple if you think about it. John's gospel describes Jesus traveling all around Palestine. He's in Judea, he's on the other side of the Jordan baptizing near where John is baptizing. He's in Samaria, he goes back up to Galilee, he comes back down to Judea. He's traveling all around, but we don't have a description of those travels in the synoptic gospels. Instead, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they really only describe one trip to Jerusalem. John describes more than one trip to Jerusalem, numerous trips to Jerusalem, which is probably what really happened. But for the synoptic gospels, the only really important trip to Jerusalem is the one in which the Lord is arrested and crucified. So if they're going to put the cleansing of the temple someplace in their gospels, it has to be in that trip. And it didn't really matter whether or not it happened at the beginning of his ministry, at the end of his ministry. Either way, it is the reason why the Jewish leaders felt threatened by Jesus. And we're going to be talking about that in this lesson today. So I think we have to allow each of the evangelists to tell the story in their own way. And I do think that exactly when it happened is not important, because all of the evangelists agree that it was extremely important and that this was the event that led to the arrest and crucifixion of the Lord. So what is this event all about, the cleansing of the temple? It was a prophetic act by the Lord. It was a dramatization of what was going to happen, the prediction that the temple would one day be destroyed. Now, this was also prophesied, and Jesus both fulfills a prophecy and he's making a prophecy, but he does predict the destruction of the temple. But we know about that from his conversation with the disciples as they're looking at the Temple Mount from the other side of the Kidron Valley. And we're going to talk about that too, because that's when Jesus begins to ask him about the end times. He makes his eschatological predictions. We're coming up on that section of the gospel. So there were prophecies that foretold a day in which there would no longer be traders in the house of the Lord. I don't mean TRAITORS, traders, but people conducting trade. In other words, buying and selling. There would be none of those traders in the house of the Lord. That's Zechariah. Zechariah has a lot of messianic prophecies. That's Zechariah 14:21. And also both Ezekiel and Zechariah foretold that the Messiah would purify the temple. Have you ever wondered why it's called the cleansing of the temple, when Jesus actually seems to have made a big mess when he got to the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and letting all the animals and the birds loose and that sort of a thing? So it's called the cleansing of the temple because it's a purification of the temple, and that's in direct fulfillment of prophecy. That's Ezekiel 40-48. The book of Ezekiel describes a lot of corruption among the priests, and that was actually of Solomon's temple, and corruption in the temple sacrificial system. And also Zechariah 6 foretold that the Messiah would purify the temple, which not that it had been corrupted by pagans, but by Jews, by who were engaged in sort of hypocritical worship, empty formalism. The priests weren't really devoted. They were just going through the motions. And so this was a very corrupt temple system. And also people made a lot of money off of the temple. We're going to talk about this. So the purification of the temple is part of the claims of Jesus's messiahship. And that's one reason why it may also be placed here right after the entry into Jerusalem by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because remember that Jesus entered Jerusalem, and then almost immediately he cleanses the temple, and he entered Jerusalem to the acclamation of the crowds, calling him Son of David and King of Israel. These were messianic titles. So this is part and parcel of this recognition or statement by him or acceptance by him that he is the Messiah. He didn't come out and say, I am the Messiah, but he did not deny it. And he's doing all of these things that support or encourage the belief that he is the Messiah. And this is one reason also that the Jewish leaders are alarmed by these claims. They're not happy about it. They didn't want the Messiah to come because they were in control, right? So this temple system, the corruption of the temple system was being challenged by Jesus, not the temple itself. This is not a repudiation of the temple or the priesthood or anything like that, but of its corruption. And it had a huge role to play in the political life of the people, in the economic life and the religious life of the people. And of course, people relied on the temple for their livelihood. Almost everybody in Jerusalem relied on it for the economic engine of the city. So it was extremely important for the Jews. The temple in Jerusalem, as we mentioned last time, there was only one temple in the whole world. And so if someone wanted to fulfill the requirements of the law, to participate in something like Passover, where you brought a lamb for sacrifice, or you brought a sacrifice for the birth of your first child, something like that, or you wanted to make a sin offering or some other kind of an offering using an animal as sacrifice, it had to be in Jerusalem. There were only two temples in the entire history of the Jewish people. The Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and then this temple, which was called the Second Temple. Don't call it Herod's temple, because Herod did not build it. This temple had been around long before Herod was around. 500 years before Herod. Herod began the process of enlarging and beautifying the temple. That process did not finish in Herod's lifetime. That process took 80 years. But he was instrumental in the enlargement and beautification of the temple. Let's talk about why animals were being sold at the temple. Of course, Jesus is reacting to the corruption, but I don't think it's simply that animals were being sold there on the Temple Mount. People were coming to the temple from all over the Roman world. The Jews were coming to the temple to offer sacrifice. Now, certainly it was a convenience to not have to carry an animal with you from your home, not to mention the fact that perhaps you didn't have a lot of animals. Maybe you lived in a city or something of this nature. But it's not simply a matter of convenience. The animals were sold there because priests had to certify every animal as fit for sacrifice. There were specific requirements. The animal had to be perfect. It had to be without blemish. You couldn't take an animal from your farm. Let's say you had one that was a little bit deformed, or was was missing an eye, or was lame or something like this. You couldn't bring that. It had to be perfect. You couldn't bring your leftovers and offer them to the Lord, or something that was anything less than perfect. You had to bring your best to the Lord. And so that's why the priests had to certify that the animals were fit for sacrifice. And this is one reason why it is said the animals were being sold on the Temple Mount. It is said that they were being sold in the royal stoa, that set of columns that I told you about last time. But exactly where the cleansing of the temple happened, we are not sure. We do not know. Some people say that they were selling, people had set up little booths and were selling and trading in other places of the Temple Mount. And this is what Jesus got upset about, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. Now, here's one question. Even if the animals had to be certified as fit for sacrifice by the priests, that did not necessarily mean that it had to take place on the Temple Mount itself. There's a whole city down below. They could have certified animals down in the markets below the temple. So this could be one of the reasons why that we're not certain that they were always or had always been selling animals right on the temple grounds themselves. There is some theory, I'll just share this with you, that that at a certain point or prior to this, that they were not selling animals on the Temple Mount, but they were selling them elsewhere. They were selling them, actually, some people think, on the Mount of Olives. As the people were, because when people would come to Jerusalem very often, they would come from the east, from the Mount of Olives, and then they would come down the Kidron Valley and go up the hill into Jerusalem. And the reason for that was because if you were coming from Galilee, as you see, you have Galilee in the north, and then Samaria, and then Judea. So in between Galilee, which was a mostly Jewish territory, and Judea, which was Jewish territory, you have Samaria. And that was considered a place where Jews avoided, not only because the Samaritans were hostile, but if they were on their way to the temple, they would be defiled by passing through Samaria. So they would go from Galilee, they would cross the Jordan River, and then they would go on the other side of the Jordan River, and then they would cross it again, and then they would enter Jerusalem from the east, Judea from the east, and they would go through Bethany and Jericho and places like that to enter Jerusalem. So they would avoid defilement, because if they had been defiled by contact with the Samaritans, they couldn't enter the temple. So there is a theory that there's a kind of a story that at a certain point, Caiaphas, the high priest, was in a dispute with the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was responsible or making money from the sale of animals in a location that was not on the Temple Mount, and Caiaphas allowed the sale of animals on the Temple Mount, and this was what was going on. This was what was behind Jesus' cleansing of the temple. I'm not so sure about that. I don't know. This is a very sort of theoretical, but there is a reference in some Jewish history to the fact that the Sanhedrin had been expelled from the Temple Mount by Caiaphas. He had in some kind of dispute with them, so they were no longer meeting on the Temple Mount. This is possible. And that happened in around the year 30, and this is when Caiaphas allowed the animals to be sold on the Temple Mount, kind of to undercut or undermine the Sanhedrin. But this is very, very speculative. Because if you think about it, Jesus had been to the Temple Mount dozens and dozens of times in his 30 or 33 years. Whether this happened in the first year of his ministry or at the very end of his ministry, he'd been coming to the temple since he was a little boy. And if he had seen animals for sale on the Temple Mount, or even if he hadn't, it doesn't seem to be enough to prompt this kind of a reaction by him. In other words, I don't think that Jesus was prompted by some technical violation of the Jewish law. They shouldn't be selling animals there. And this just happened very recently under Caiaphas. I think it's much deeper than this, and it has to do with the corruption of the entire system. This is why I'm not so sure about this theory that Caiaphas just suddenly had allowed the sale of the temple of animals on the Temple Mount. I find that kind of hard to believe. So what happened here? Why did Christ act the way he did? I said that this was a prophetic act. It was a symbolic act. Now, if you're familiar with the prophets of the Old Testament, sometimes they engaged in what we call symbolic actions. For example, Jeremiah wore a wooden yoke around his neck. Y-O-K-E, the big piece of wood that was placed over the heads of animals to guide them. And the law was called a yoke. And Jeremiah wore this wooden yoke through the streets of Jerusalem to indicate slavery, not the law of Moses, but that soon Judea would be conquered by the Babylonians, and the Judeans would become slaves of the Babylonians. So this was a prophetic act. Or he smashed a pot, a clay pot, to indicate that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So sometimes they would dramatize their message. There's some similar things that happened with Ezekiel and other prophets. So they would dramatize the message. It's a very effective way to get people's attention and for them to understand your message in a very clear and dramatic fashion. So Christ's action of cleansing the temple, of driving out the sellers of animals and the money changers, is not an angry outburst that he suddenly sees this happening on the Temple Mount and gets angry, but it's a symbol of the purging of the corruption of the temple and the future restoration of the true worship of God, which would be uncorrupted, which would not involve the blood of animals. So it's fulfillment of prophecy on one hand. Remember, that's very big for Matthew. Matthew is all about how Jesus fulfills the prophecies, right? Remember that? This is his main theme, that Jesus is the Messiah. He fulfills the prophecies. He doesn't quote the prophecies every time Jesus fulfills them, but he often does. Here he doesn't quote it, except that it's in the mouth of Jesus when he defends his actions to the temple authorities. But it's both Jesus fulfilling the prophecy, and what is that? That's the prophecy that the Messiah would purify the temple. And there's another prophecy, and that is the prophecy that Jesus makes, that someday the temple would be destroyed. So by cleansing the temple, he is himself making a prophecy that the temple would be destroyed in the future, and it was. It was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, after the Jews rebelled against the Romans and started a war called the Jewish War. The Jewish War lasted from the year 66 to 73, but the important date is the date 70. In the year 70, the temple was destroyed. It was never rebuilt, and the Jews would have wanted to rebuild it, but they rebelled again, and the Romans did not allow them to live in Judea, so they were not able to rebuild it. They attempted later to rebuild it, but both attempts were thwarted by mysterious forces, we can say. Christians all believed that it was God who prevented the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. There are a lot of evangelical Christians who are very, very interested in the modern state of Israel and really want to help the Jews rebuild the temple, which would be a third temple if they were able to rebuild it. And they believe that this is necessary for the Lord to return. I don't think that's true. It's very possible that the temple that was spoken of, or the prophecy that St. Paul made, that the Messiah that the Antichrist will come and sit in the temple, could be referring to a church, not necessarily the restoration of the Jewish temple. I don't personally think that God will allow the restoration of the Jewish temple because he didn't so far. And there's an important reasoning for that. And this is why the Lord, because the sacrificial system was abolished by the Lord, by the destruction of the temple once and for all. And the early Christians all understood the meaning of this, that the Lord had said that in the future people will worship me in spirit and in truth, and not with the blood of animals. And so the destruction of the temple, which didn't happen immediately after the death of the Lord, but shortly thereafter, in the year 70, after the church was established, all of the Christians understood what that meant, that it was the end of the sacrificial system. And since that time, Jerusalem is forever changed. Not Jerusalem, the Judaism is forever changed. Judaism is not the same religion today as it was when the temple stood. So there is no priesthood, there is no sacrifice, there are no animal sacrifices because there is no temple. So the Lord did not lose his temper. This is what I'm going to say, just repeat this. Because very often when we lose our temper, sometimes we will say, well, Jesus got angry. No, he did not get angry. This is not how we get angry when we lose our temper because of our pride or something like this, or we're unable to control that passion of anger, and so it comes out, we yell at somebody or we do something. The Lord did not lose his temper. The Lord was always in control. It was a very deliberate act. And even if there was a kind of righteousness about it, it wasn't done out of anger or out of a loss of self-control. Okay, let's take a break at this point, and when we return, we'll talk about the money changers. Why were the money changers on the Temple Mount? What did they have to do with all of this? Join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so what about those money changers? Well, there were lots of different kinds of coins in the Roman Empire, and you might have thought that because it's one empire, there would be sort of a universal monetary system, but that was not the case. Certainly, the Romans did mint coins, but other kingdoms also minted coins, and a lot of even minor rulers minted coins. Even Pontius Pilate, believe it or not, minted coins of his own. So why was this? Well, because remember that the Roman Empire, first of all, it's extremely difficult to manage such a vast empire. And the Roman Empire encompassed a lot of different groups of people, lots of different nations, and even kingdoms, and sometimes independent free cities. So we think of it as sort of more homogenous than it really was. Everybody who was part of the empire, every kingdom, every ruler, had to answer to Rome. They had to keep the peace, and they had to send their tax money. But the Romans were very happy to have these various local officials running their little area, so that the Romans didn't have to do it. Because if you really think about it, there weren't all that many Romans to manage or to administer every part of this empire by themselves. So they enlisted the help of local aristocrats, sometimes kings. We call them satellite kings, people like Herod the Great or Herod Antipas, who is the king now that Jesus is an adult. That's Herod the Great's second son. And so they used these local rulers and allowed them to remain in power. They didn't care if they abused their power. Very rarely did they ever step in to remove a king. They did sometimes. They did that with Herod the Great's first son, Archelaus. But mostly they just allowed them to rule. And so there was this kind of, you wash my back, I'll wash yours, or one hand washes the other hand, a kind of arrangement that the Romans had. So there were lots of independent kingdoms. Remember, the Romans didn't just conquer the Jews. They conquered lots of little nations and kingdoms. And also there were free cities, that is, independent cities that ran their own affairs. As I said, they're still under Rome. If they rebelled against Rome, Rome would have come in and crushed them. As a matter of fact, that happened with Sepphoris, which was the capital of Galilee before the time of Jesus. There was a very well-known city called Sepphoris, and they refused to pay their taxes. And the Romans came and they burnt the city to the ground and killed a lot of people and made everybody else a slave. So that's how they would handle things. So if you're allowed to manage your own affairs, that's well and good, but you have to pay your taxes to Rome and you have to maintain the peace. That's the arrangement. So there were lots of, all of these different kingdoms and free cities would mint their own coins, which meant that because coins were of different sizes, they had different amounts of silver or bronze or gold or whatever the metal was. They didn't all equal the same. Imagine the confusion of that. But they didn't have the same monetary value because the amount of silver in one coin was different than the amount of silver in another coin, assuming that they're both silver. So this is kind of problematic. So the coins varied tremendously in their size, in their weight, in the purity of the metal. And a lot of the local coins, the coins that were minted by people like Pilate, would have been bronze coins, or little smaller, would be like the equivalent of, of quarters or of dollar bills or something like this, small change. Silver coins were amounted to a lot more money, and they would have been minted by cities and also by the Roman state, but they would have had a higher value. So Roman silver coins, were only about 80% or 85% silver. But the coins of the city of Tyre, Tyre, which was a coastal city, a coastal kingdom on the coast of Palestine, not too far away from Galilee, they were 94% silver. And they minted that became the standard coin for the worship in the temple. So you had to, if you wanted to buy an animal, imagine the temple and the temple treasury. They didn't want to deal with all kinds of different types of coins. They made it very simple. All of the merchandise was sold in using the coins of Tyre. If you were going to buy an animal for sacrifice on the Temple Mount, you had to use the silver shekel of the city of Tyre. It had a higher purity value, and it was standardized so that the temple treasury wasn't dealing with coins of different sizes and various denominations and various materials, whether it was gold or silver or bronze. It was one kind of coin, and that's also how you paid your temple tax. So this is why you had to have the money changers there. So also, when you went up to the temple, you might need to pay your temple tax. If you were a man and you hadn't paid your annual temple tax, which was 2 denarii, which was half a shekel, you had to be able to pay it with the proper thing, with the proper coin. And so that was this particular coin. The Jews did not mint the temple coins. They just used the coin that was in the region that had the highest quality of silver in it and was standard unit of monetary measurement, and that was the silver shekel of Tyre. So when Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver for betraying Christ, that would have been that coin, okay? So that's why the money changers were there. Now, what happened when the Lord comes into the temple and he cleanses the temple? We're not sure exactly where. This would not have happened inside the temple courtyards themselves, what I described last time. It would be either in the court of the Gentiles outside or in the royal stoa. Is he complaining about the priests? Is he rejecting formal worship or ritual sacrifice or the priesthood or anything like this? Because some Protestants say this. No, he was not, because he is insisting upon the sanctity of the temple by cleansing the temple. Yes, he's foretelling its destruction, but his words, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. You can see there that he's correcting the fact that the system had become corrupt. He's not rejecting the entire system, because that system was put into place by God himself. It is God who said what sacrifices would be offered for various kinds of sins, what sacrifice would be offered for Yom Kippur, what sacrifices would be offered for Passover, and the like. So Jesus is not repudiating temple worship or sacrifice. He is repudiating the corruption of it, and it was a prophecy that this would be replaced eventually with a purely spiritual worship, that the animal sacrifices of the temple would one day soon end. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because he's not rejecting priesthood, and some Protestants will use this story as an argument against priesthood. But I did think we might talk just very briefly about the priests who served in the temple, we didn't have time to talk about that last week. The ordinary priests, because later we will talk about the chief priests. Those are the ones who confront Christ, and they're the ones who orchestrate his death. Now, there were lots of different priests. First of all, in order to be a priest, a Jewish priest, you had to be from the tribe of Levi. And that was the tribe of Moses and Aaron. Now, the tribe of Levi was divided into two sections, the Levites and the priests. If you were a boy, you're born into the tribe of Levi and into the Levite branch. When you grew up, you became a Levite. You could never decide you want to be a priest. You couldn't graduate from Levite to priest. That didn't happen. You're either born to become a Levite or you're born into the priestly side and you become a priest. So there was no, when you were a little boy, you never said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a priest. That didn't happen. You're either born into that tribe and you're born into the priestly side of the tribe of Levi, or you're not. If you weren't, then you couldn't become a priest. So it was purely hereditary. Now, these priests that were divided into 24 divisions, there were also 24 divisions of Levites, and they would go to the temple and serve in the temple for 2 weeks out of the year, not at the same time, 24, and there's 52, weeks out of the year. So they would go for a week at a time, and then they go back home, and they come back at another time, according to a kind of rotation system. So both the priests and the Levites would go to Jerusalem and serve at the temple, and they were supposed to receive some compensation. That meant that they did not earn their living as a priest. They did something else. All the other 50 weeks out of the year, they were doing something else. They were farmers or fishermen or traders or, working in metal or making, sandals, whatever it was that they did. They had to have some other way to support themselves. They could not support themselves working 2 weeks out of the year at the temple. That was their responsibility as a member of that tribe. They would also go to the temple for all of the pilgrim festivals, the 3 pilgrim festivals, Passover, Sukkot, and that's the Passover, the Feast of Booths, and the Feast of Pentecost, Shavuot and Sukkot. So those had so many people would come to Jerusalem for those feasts that it was sort of all hands on deck. All the priests and Levites would come to assist with the large crowds. So most of the time, these are just ordinary people, like the father of John the Baptist and forerunner, Zechariah. He's an ordinary priest, and we're told exactly which division he belongs to, the division of Abijah. That's told to us in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And the priests would go there, and they would spend a week there, and they would make sacrifices on behalf of the people who brought animals for sacrifice. But there were also daily sacrifices that were offered to the Lord in the temple. Twice a day, a sacrifice of a lamb was offered in the morning, once in the morning and once in the afternoon at 3 p.m., at 9 a.m. and at 3 p.m. And a lamb was sacrificed. And this is what is referred to in the book of Acts, when it says that Peter and John went up to the temple to pray at the time of 3 p.m. They were going up there. People would routinely go there to pray at the time of the sacrifice of that lamb. But other things were needed for the priests to do. A lot of priests were trained in certain kinds of trades that were necessary for the maintenance of the area inside the court of the priests, where no one could set foot ever if you weren't a priest. So whatever necessary work was needed there, either to add gold to the decoration or masonry or even cleaning of that area, all of that had to be done by priests who were allowed to enter that area. And they would also burn incense before the Lord. This is what Zechariah was doing, the father of John the forerunner. They would replace the loaves of the showbread and things like this. So they would, if a person brought an animal to be sacrificed, then the priest would sometimes burn the whole animal. Sometimes they would skin it and give part of it back to the person. Sometimes only certain portions were burnt. And so there were lots of different regulations. Another priest was needed for blowing the silver trumpet to announce the beginning of the Sabbath. Priests might examine somebody who said that they were cured for leprosy. Priests were needed to examine all of the wood that was burnt for the sacrifice. The wood could not contain any insects because insects were considered unclean. So there were many jobs that were needed to be performed by priests, and they were respected. Now, as I mentioned, as part of their compensation for the weeks that they were not working twice a year, they were supposed to be given some of the proceeds, either first fruits, which people brought to the temple, or other valuable things, such as hides. So if there was going to be an offering, sometimes they would skin the animal, and then they would keep the hides. And the hides were used, for a lot of things, including leather. You got leather from the hide, and that could be very valuable. So one of the things that was happening was that the chief priests were stealing the compensation that was supposed to be going to the ordinary priests. This was one of the ways that they were, frankly, showing their corruption. The corruption of the system was the fact that these chief priests, and we know about this from Jewish sources, by the way, were stealing the tithes, the fruits and vegetables that were given to the ordinary priests. They were stealing the hides or the meat that they were supposed to take home, because sometimes the priests could eat the sacrificial meat, they could take it home. And so many Jewish writings from that period, the late Second Temple period, describe the extreme corruption of the chief priests. They were beating and they were mistreating the ordinary priests. So this is one of the things that the Lord is bringing to their attention as part of this corruption. When he calls them robbers, this is what he means. So before we go on to talk about the words of the Lord, let me just mention the Levites, since we're on this topic of the priesthood. There were the Levites also numbered in the thousands. By the way, we don't know exactly how many ordinary priests served the temple, but the estimates range from about 10,000 to about 18,000 priests, which is a lot, but it was necessary for the large crowds that would come for the major pilgrim festivals. Likewise, there were thousands of men who supported the temple and worked at the temple as Levites. Levites were like the assistants of the temple, assistants to the priests, but they couldn't set foot in the court of the priests, and they couldn't assist with the sacrifices. They're not like our deacons. Don't think like that. They were the ones who were responsible for crowd control. They were responsible for making sure that everyone was clean when they entered the temple precincts, that nobody was impure when they entered, that they had all gone through a mikvah, they'd all washed themselves. They were responsible for securing the temple grounds, for closing the gates and patrolling the temple grounds. They made arrests. The temple guards consisted of Levites. They would also, haul things like, water and wood and things like this. So they were doing things like that also. But they're considered the most important role, or we could say the prize role of the Levites, was that they were the ones who played instruments and sang at the services. So if you were a Levite with a good voice and you could be in the choir, that was considered the best thing of all. So we know that they did that also. So now that we know something about the priesthood and the temple, let's talk about what the Lord's motivation when he said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." So why the word robbers? First of all, he is referring to or alluding to Jeremiah, who called the temple a den of robbers. Now, toward the end of the period of Solomon's temple, when you have these major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel especially, they were protesting against the corruption of the temple of Solomon and the priests who were running the temple. So especially Ezekiel is especially known for this, talking against them as false shepherds, that they don't take care of the flock. So this was something that was a reality also under Solomon's temple toward the end before its destruction. and also now at the end of the period of the Second Temple. So Jeremiah described the temple as a den of robbers. And so Jesus is echoing the words of Jeremiah. And they're condemning the hypocrisy of the priests who, especially the chief priests, again, not these ordinary priests that I talked about, who got almost nothing for their time that they were serving the temple, but the people who are running the temple, those are the chief priests. They're like the Jewish aristocracy. They are very wealthy, and they have their wealth and their power from their position at the temple. They're the ones who decide who is going to be allowed to sell animals on the Temple Mount, who's going to be allowed to change money at the Temple Mount. And they were profiting from their position, and they were offering very empty worship to the Lord without real devotion, going through the motions of the sacrifices. So the Lord said, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And he is echoing Jeremiah there, and echoing the word robbers, because a robber, or using the word robber, listis, because a robber is somebody who forcibly takes something valuable from another person. That's different than burglary. That's different from simple theft. If somebody steals your wallet because you set it down or something like, and they take it from you as you're not looking, that's a theft, but that's not robbery. If somebody breaks into your house while you're at work and steals things, that's not robbery. That's a burglary. Robbery is when somebody forcibly takes something off of your person or from your immediate possession by threat of violence or by the use of violence. That's what was happening to the ordinary priests by the chief priests. They literally were sending their servants to beat with clubs ordinary priests and steal their agricultural produce, steal the meat, steal the hides just before they were to leave and go back home with the what was supposed to be their compensation for their week's work at the temple. And these things were supposed to go to the priests. That's how they supported themselves for that week that they weren't earning any money or had made a long trip from a far away. Not all the priests didn't all just live right there in Jerusalem. So they would serve the temple without pay, but they were supposed to be compensated with the agricultural tithes and the meat and the hides. And we know this, again, from Jewish sources. Christians don't write about this, but Jews from the period of the first century and the first century BC, and even afterwards, when the Jews were describing or discussing why the Lord allowed the temple to be destroyed, they talk about this. They say because the system had become corrupt, because the chief priests were taking advantage of the ordinary priests and literally robbing them of the proceeds of their work. So it's a very deliberate thing that the Lord says, you've made it a house of or a den of robbers, because that's what they were doing. They were robbing ordinary, hardworking priests of what was fairly and properly due to them. So I think it's really important that we recognize that the Lord is not condemning the temple worship or the temple itself or priesthood itself, but instead he's affirming the sanctity of the temple, the fact that the temple should be treated with honor and reverence, and people should come there and offer worship and serve the Lord with a clean heart and without greed or some other kind of motivation like getting rich off of the temple. So the Lord wasn't necessarily objecting to the sale of the animals themselves, but to the system which was corrupt, through which the chief priests were becoming wealthy. They were giving favors to certain families and allowing them to sell animals, definitely getting a kickback, so they were profiting from it. The same thing with the money changers. The money changers also were not necessarily using standard and fair weights. It is known that they were using dishonest scales. They were cheating the worshipers, and the chief priests were getting a percentage of the money changers' profits from doing their money exchanging on the temple grounds. So all of this commerce and the commercialization of the temple definitely cheapened the temple. It's something that could have been done in the city below, but without a doubt, the Lord was making a statement there that that they had become robbers. Now, what's kind of ironic about this is that the Lord will be crucified between two robbers. It's the same word, listis. And that's not an accident. I do believe that it was quite deliberate on the part of the Jewish leaders to make sure that Jesus got the kind of punishment they thought he deserved. It was as though they were saying, you're saying that we're robbers, you're going to die, and we're going to put you with the robbers. And he's crucified between the two thieves, as if sharing their reputation. So it was a way of really telling Jesus that you said that we're robbers, but really you're going to be dying. You're going to die as a robber yourself. Even though he wasn't accused of robbery, it was because of his association being crucified between two thieves. So the temple was extremely corrupt. The motivation of the chief priests, I think that most of the ordinary priests were honest, hardworking priests, but the chief priests were not motivated by piety. They weren't motivated by a desire to make sure that the worship of the Lord was done properly, uninterrupted. Definitely, they had a personal interest in the temple as the place of their power, their prestige, and because of this, they had become very corrupt, very greedy, and we know all about this from the Jewish writings of the period. Now, Jesus comes and does this act, which everybody recognizes as a prophetic act, because they all knew the prophets. We're not as familiar with the prophets as these people were. They understood a prophetic, symbolic act when they saw it. Jesus says this line that everybody knew from, referring to the den of robbers. Everybody knew it from Jeremiah. Everybody already thinks that Jesus is at least a prophet, if not the Messiah. They all knew the prophecies that the Messiah would purify the temple. So everybody becomes extremely alarmed by this action, especially the establishment, especially the Jewish leaders. And the leadership had as its power base the temple, because the temple was where the money was. And of course, if you want to know where the power is, follow the money. And they decided that Jesus could not be ignored. They knew that Jesus had a tremendous following behind him, that earlier in that week, or just the day before, they had welcomed him into Jerusalem, calling him Messiah, son of David, the King of Israel. And he also claimed authority. Let's not forget that. He claimed authority to forgive sins. He claimed authority to rewrite the Sabbath laws and other things. So they were worried about him. They knew that if he wanted to start a revolt in Jerusalem, he could do it because he had the support of the people and the backing of the people. So this is what alarms them. They're not so much concerned about losing the temple as they are about losing their position in the temple, in the leadership of Judaism, which would mean the end of their prestige, their power, and their money. So when we return, we're going to talk about this reference to the blind and the lame that came to the Lord at the temple, and also the statement of the children. What does the Lord have to say about that? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
People often complain that the Divine Liturgy is always the same, week after week. But every ritual, phrase, and action in the service has meaning and purpose, drawing in worshipers with its hymns and prayers and allowing ordinary people to leave the world and enter heaven for a short time. In the new book, Blessed is the Kingdom, Father Stavros Akroterianakis, a longtime parish priest, offers reflections on the text of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom to help readers learn to pray the liturgy and to understand and appreciate the mystery that unfolds each time it is celebrated. Available now at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
we're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so verse 14 in the story of the cleansing of the temple is unique to Matthew. And this is a little detail that Matthew includes. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Now, this is also indicates something as far as Matthew is concerned, that there's going to be a new order when Jesus cleanses the temple, when the temple is destroyed. And this is because King David had decreed that the blind and the lame were forbidden from entering the house of God. Now, when David was alive, there was no temple. The temple was built by his son Solomon. When David was alive, they were still worshiping in the tabernacle. That was kind of a tent that was constructed during the Exodus period, after they left Egypt. So this is how they were worshiping until Solomon built the temple. So more than 200 years, they were worshiping the tabernacle. Now, why would the blind and the lame be forbidden from entering the temple? Well, this is because that was seen as an imperfection and also a kind of a curse by God. And so David did not allow that. Now, the lame, it would have been difficult for them to ascend the temple steps anyhow. I suppose the blind could have done it. But you were supposed to only be able to come up to the temple on your own power. If you didn't have the ability to walk up the steps of the temple by yourself, then you weren't supposed to be there. So, but there was also this sense of the imperfection of the person, and remembering that anything like paralysis or some kind of weakness or illness or blindness was considered a curse by God. They were forbidden from entering the temple, but here they come while Jesus is cleansing the temple, and he heals them. So Jesus is Son of David. Remember, he was welcomed into the city as Son of David. That's messianic title, that he's a successor of David, and he welcomes the blind and the lame in the temple, and he heals them. And this signifies that there's a new era, that even if that these things are not barriers to the worship of the Lord, that God accepts all people, that God does not recognize these things as signifying that you're unacceptable in the sight of God. So, all right. What about the statement of the children, which by the way, we remember, of course, the cleansing of the temple at the entrance to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And this is the verse that we sing. This is the communion hymn in the Orthodox Church. It's from the Psalms. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, thou hast perfected praise, or has brought perfect praise. Okay, so this, what are they saying to him? They're saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, Son of David. And this is what people were saying at the entrance into Jerusalem. So now the children start shouting Hosanna to Jesus. And this is a quote from Psalm 8:2. What the Lord says is a quote from Psalm 8:2. And when he's confronted by the Jewish leaders, because he's allowing the children to say, Hosanna, save us, Son of David, they say, don't you hear what they're saying? Why don't you stop them? Why don't you make them be quiet? And he says, haven't you heard it said? Or have you not read? Or it is written that out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, you have brought perfect praise, or you have perfected praise. So that Psalm 8, this is from Psalm 8, verse 2, speaks about the praise offered to God. It's not the praise of a human being. It's the praise that's offered to God. And the fathers of the church, when they comment on this passage, know this. So let us hear what St. John Chrysostom says about this. And you'll hear how he knows, he's read the psalm, and he knows that the Lord is saying that there's much more at stake here. The children are not simply parroting something that they heard, but they have been sort of divinely inspired to say this. Here's St. John Chrysostom from his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. But not only in this way does he show his authority, but also by healing various infirmities. For the blind and the lame came to him, and he healed them, and his power and authority he indicates. In other words, the fact that he accepts the blind and the lame on the Temple Mount shows that he accepts them. That shows that he has the authority, and that he has the authority to accept them is shown by his power to heal them. But not even so would they be persuaded, but together with the rest of the miracles, hearing even the children proclaiming, they were ready to choke and say, "Do you not hear what these children are saying?" And yet it was Christ's part to have said this to them. Have you not heard? For what the children were singing to him was as to God. What did he say? Since they were speaking against these manifest things, that the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, he applies his correction more in the way of a reproof, saying, "Have you never read, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings you have perfected praise?" And well did he say, out of the mouth, for what was said was not of their understanding, but of his power, giving articulation to their yet immature tongues. In other words, what they said had to come from God, because the children didn't understand what they were saying. They didn't understand the significance of it. Sort of like when Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," and Jesus says, "It's not human beings that have told you to say this. It's not that you have figured this out by your own mind, Peter, but my Father who is in heaven has revealed this to you." So this is the act of God having the children say these things. And so this is why the Lord says it's recognizing this because of their immaturity. This is a divine statement. This is Chrysostom. And this was also a type of the Gentiles, lisping and sounding forth at once great things with understanding and faith. And for the apostles also, there was from this no small consolation, for that they might not be perplexed, how being unlearned, they may be able to publish the gospel. The children anticipate them and remove their anxiety, teaching them that he would grant them utterance, who made even these infants to sing praises. So he's saying that this sort of comforted, I kind of like that, comforted the disciples who were not educated, and yet they knew that if the children were able to recognize these things and be inspired to say these things, they too would be able to preach the gospel. And not only so, Chrysostom says, but the miracle showed that he is creator even of nature. The children then, although of an immature age, uttered these things that had a clear meaning and were in accordance with those above. But the men uttered things teeming with frenzy and madness, for such is the nature of wickedness. All right, let's see what St. Gregory Palamas says, because he also comments about the children, and he says this, St. Gregory Palamas, when the scribes and Pharisees, on the other hand, saw the wonderful things that he did and the children crying in the temple, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were displeased and said to the Lord, do you hear what they say? In fact, it would have been more appropriate for the Lord to put the same question to them. That's a good point. The children, in their innocence, recognized, or at least were vessels for the Lord to say the truth about Christ. And it would have been better to Jesus say, do you hear what the children say? They know the truth and you can't even see it. Because why couldn't they see it? Because the Jewish leaders were too concerned about preserving their own power. In fact, it would have been more appropriate for the Lord to put the same question to them. Can you not see or hear or understand? To refute those who were complaining that he tolerated songs of praise that were fit for God alone, he replied, yes, I hear those who, invisibly enlightened by myself, declare such things about me. But if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out. Have you never read the prophecy that, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, thou hast perfected praise? This was another amazing fact, that simple, uneducated children should speak perfectly of the divinity of God made man for our sake, that their voices should take up the angelic hymn. At the Lord's birth, the angels sang, "Glory to God in the highest and on earth." And now at the time of his entry into Jerusalem, the children offered up the same hymn, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Hosanna in the highest. Let us, young and old, rulers and subjects, be childlike in innocence, that God may empower us to make a public show of the trophies and carry aloft the symbols of victory. Not just of victory over evil passions, but over visible and invisible enemies. And may we find the grace of the word to help in times of need. The young colt which the Lord deigned to ride on for our sake prefigured, although it was only one, the Gentiles' obedience to him, and we, governors and governed alike, are like Gentiles that come from them. So he's comparing it to the remembering, of course, this is connected to the entry into Jerusalem, and reminding us about the fact that the children were able to offer this praise because of their innocence and their openness to God, something which we do not ordinarily have, because once we get old, we lose that kind of innocence that allows for certain, we could say, it's the purity of the mind that we lose from sin as we get older. Okay, let's just read from the commentary of St. Luke's Gospel by Cyril of Alexandria, who also mentions this, and I think he has some very good insights into the cleansing of the temple. If you were acquainted with the scriptures, which are inspired by God, and the words and predictions of the holy prophets, you would have remembered perchance the blessed David, who said in the Spirit unto Christ, "The Lord has sworn and will not repent. You are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Explain therefore what the Pharisees or scribes has ministered unto God after the order of Melchizedek, and blessed and received tithes of Abraham." So here he's tying the fact that the Lord is cleansing the temple, and that is appropriate for him to do so because he is after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a figure from Genesis. He is predates the priesthood of Aaron and is seen as a type of Christ. And Abraham meets Melchizedek and pays him honor, and gives him tithes. So this is what Cyril is referring to, that the Lord was blessed by the priesthood of Melchizedek. That's kind of an eternal priesthood. And Melchizedek and his priesthood was a type of Christ, the Savior of us all, who has been made our high priest and apostle, not bringing near to God the Father those who believe in him by means of bloody sacrifices, by offerings of incense, but perfecting them into holiness by a service superior to the law. For such a high priest we have. So remember that with Melchizedek, they're not offering sacrifices of blood. Now that Jesus is the high priest of all of us, this is something which is elaborated on in the book of Hebrews. He brings us to God, but not through the sacrifice of animals, the sacrifice of blood. The bloody sacrifices which they offer are not well-pleasing to God. For he even said to them, "I have hated and have rejected your festivals, and will not smell your solemn assemblies, because even though you bring me whole burnt offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard the salvation of your appearance. Take them away from me, the sounding of praises, nor will I hear the psalmody of instruments." This is a quote from Amos, another of the Old Testament prophets. Again, the Lord rejecting the sacrifices of the Jews because of their empty formality, because they weren't doing it with their whole heart. It was an empty ritual. They weren't really trying to live lives of holiness and purity. Instead, they were just going through the motions. So this was a kind of corruption. So he says that he hated their festivals, and as well as their praises and their sacrifices were rejected by him. And yet God rejoices in being praised but not by impure mouths, nor by a defiled tongue. For it is written in the book of Psalms, but unto the sinner God has said, why do you declare my commandments and take my covenants in your mouth, when you have hated instruction and have cast out my words behind you? So he's, again, speaking against. It's not that the Lord, this is what Cyril is saying, it's not that the Lord was condemning all sacrifice or temple worship or the praise of God or sacrifices to the Lord, because the Lord is the one who instituted the temple sacrifices. It is when it's done by unclean people and done as a mere empty formality. So we have to be careful of that. So what other significance does the cleansing of the temple have? As I mentioned, it is the end of the sacrificial system. It's very similar to the tearing of the temple curtain, which we will talk about at the crucifixion of Christ. Christ perfected the law. He fulfilled it. He made animal sacrifice unnecessary with his death and resurrection. Nobody is aware of that meaning at the time that the Lord is cleansing the temple. But he cleanses the temple because he is now well into his public ministry. The crucifixion was approaching, whether this is the very end of his life on earth, the last week of his life, or whether this is the beginning of his public ministry as it is described in John. His crucifixion was approaching, and worship would change because of it. And people would soon worship God in spirit and in truth, not with the blood of irrational animals, which is what the Jews had been doing during this entire period of hundreds and hundreds of years. This is what they had been doing way back from even the time of Noah. This is how the Jews were worshiping God, by offering animal sacrifice. But when the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, the prophecy of Jesus that the temple would be destroyed was fulfilled. And that prophecy was a very, very serious one, taken very seriously by the Jews. It is one of the reasons why Jeremiah was put to death, or rather he was sentenced to death. He wasn't put to death for that. He was sentenced to death for predicting the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. And of course that happened, but he wasn't put to death. Later he was martyred, but he wasn't put to death for that. He was put into prison for that. So people did not really understand when they saw the cleansing of the temple by Christ that soon it would mark the end of animal sacrifice, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Christ himself would become the perfect, spotless lamb. Christ would offer himself as the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And through this, he established a new law, a new focus, a new way of worship, a worship that was spiritual. I've mentioned this many times in the program. This phrase is part of our divine liturgy and other prayers when we refer to logiki latria, spiritual worship, sometimes translated as rational worship or something similar to that. This is what the Lord brought us, the end of worship of God by the use of animals and blood sacrifice. But at this moment, there was even more that was at stake here, because the temple was the center of the nation. It was the center of their economic system, their political system, their religious center. People depended upon it for their livelihood. And any threat to the temple was looked upon with tremendous alarm and great seriousness, and even warranted the death penalty, because the temple represented the presence of God on earth. We talked about this last time. People believed that God dwelt among his people at the temple. And to say that God would allow the temple to be destroyed, which is what Jeremiah said, the temple would be destroyed, was the same as saying that God would abandon his people. And the Jews felt a certain comfort in knowing that God was present with his people in the temple. So even though the chief priests did not like what Jesus did, and many other of the leaders, the high priest certainly didn't like what Jesus did, ordinary priests understood, and the regular people also understood. They knew that the temple system was very corrupt. Ordinary people knew this. It wasn't a secret what was happening and how people were becoming wealthy from the worship of the Lord at the temple. But the Jews didn't have an alternative. It's not like they could say, well, this temple is corrupt, so we'll go to this other temple. There was no other temple. That was the only temple that they had. So when the Lord cleansed the temple, it was a kind of provocation. It was like a calling, with giving his calling card to the chief priests and saying, almost as if to say, I'm the Messiah and I'm here to clean house. And they did not take to that very well. But remember that the temple is primarily for the Jewish people, the presence of God on earth. Now, the real deep meaning of the cleansing of the temple is that Jesus is indicating the end of the temple and bloody sacrifices, because he is God and he is on earth, and he offers himself as the perfect sacrifice. Now, the temple system was very restricted. You had to be Jewish. You had to be ritually pure to enter. Women were only allowed to go as far as the court of the women and no further. If you wanted to offer sacrifice, you had to give it to a priest. They had to be born within this particular tribe. They had to be part of that particular tribe. You had to be certified, to become a priest. You had to show your lineage and things like this and show that you really did belong to this family lineage of the tribe of Levi. So it was very restricted. And it is as though the Lord is saying that things are going to change, that access to God will no longer be limited or restricted to certain types of people, that access to God will no longer be mediated by priests in the temple. It will no longer require the killing of an animal. And not only was the worship of the one true God available only to Jews, pagans could certainly not enter the temple precincts, but also even among the Jews, the God was separated and from the people by it was only available to the high priest, who had direct access to God in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, or only the priest could offer the sacrifice. So by saying that the temple would soon be destroyed, and Jesus knowing that he was going to offer himself on the cross for the entire world, it was as though he was saying that the temple building will no longer be the one place where you can worship God. God can be worshiped anywhere, and he is present everywhere. He was physically present on earth in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, some Protestants would say that the Orthodox, and maybe they'd probably say this about the Catholics too, that we are also trying to mediate God through the priesthood, but it is not the same. First of all, this priesthood was established by Jesus Christ through the church, and the priests don't mediate Christ to us the way the priests did. The Jewish priests offered animals for sacrifice, and this is how your sins were forgiven, or you fulfilled your obligations for that particular festival. But only the high priest could actually have access to God, and that was only one day out of the year on Yom Kippur. With the destruction of the temple, Jesus is indicating, and of course with his own death and resurrection, that we can worship God everywhere and anywhere, and we can commune with God anywhere, not only on the Temple Mount. And even though the priest in our church, the Orthodox priest, is the one who through his prayers, through the prayer to the Holy Spirit, changes the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, we receive that directly. We receive Christ directly. We commune with Christ directly in the flesh, physically. That is not something that was ever available to the Jewish people. This is something which is a tremendous and dramatic change from the time of temple worship, in which people were restricted from any kind of real access to God. So the temple was destroyed, as I mentioned, by the Romans in the year 70, and it was never to be rebuilt. And I think that this was understood by the early church as a sign from God. Now, Jews to this day argue about why the temple was not rebuilt, why God allowed the temple to be destroyed in the first place. They understood that something serious happened and that something changed, but they could not really understand it. The early church, however, understood it. Temple worship, the worship of God through the sacrifice of animals, was no longer needed. because Jesus had offered himself as the perfect sacrifice. Once the Lord has offered himself as a sacrifice, how can you say that still an animal needed to be offered as a sacrifice? Because Christ fulfilled and perfected the sacrifice. All of our sins were forgiven by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the entire world was sanctified by the presence of God on earth, by the incarnation. And this is something we don't really talk about too much, but you see hints of this idea, this very, very strong in the early church, in things like Epiphany or Theophany. When we have the blessing of the waters, there's this idea that the presence of God on earth sanctified all of creation. It's not simply through his death and resurrection. Now we have communion and we receive Christ physically and he becomes part of us. It's much, much more than that. The presence of God sanctified every element of creation. And this is why we do things like that in the church. This is why we bless oil, and this is why we bless wine. This is why we bless water, because everything is sanctified by Christ, who became part of our creation, part of creation, and joined us as a human being. So at any rate, I think we'll have to end at this point, because really every human being becomes the temple of God through receiving every person who receives Holy Communion becomes the temple of God. Every single Orthodox Christian becomes sanctified not only by that presence of God on earth and through the way we sanctify all of these created things, whether it's water or oil or bread or wine, all of those things are sanctified in the church. We also become sanctified and become the temple of the living God by receiving Christ within ourselves. This is why it is important that we maintain the sanctity of our body, the holiness of our body, and not use it to engage in sin. This is why it is a sin. Immorality is a sin, because our body was sanctified not only in baptism and dedicated to God and in chrismation, but also through receiving of Holy Communion. So we have to take that very seriously, because we are each living and breathing and walking and talking temples of God. So next week, we're going to talk about something else that brings some confusion among people, and that is the cursing of the fig tree. Here again is a very strange thing, just like Jesus seems to have gotten angry at the cleansing of the temple. I just explained to you that he did not become physically angry or was not motivated by passions. He didn't lose his temper, but he was making a statement by what he did, cleansing the temple, purifying the temple. This was fulfillment of prophecy and a statement of the upcoming destruction of the temple. What about the curse of the fig tree, when we are told specifically that it was not the season for figs? Why did the Lord curse the fig tree? Now, Father Costa has a great love of figs. I must tell you that maybe I'll talk about it next week. But I'm hoping that since this is one of the things he likes to talk about, figs and the fig tree, I'm hoping I'll be able to convince him to join me next week. So tune in. We'll find out whether or not he joins us next week, because he has a lot of things to say about figs and fig trees. So next week we will talk about, because again, this is it is an event of significance, of symbolic significance, which we hear about on Holy Week. So we will discuss that next week, and I hope you will join us. So now let us close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Good night.